I want to begin this talk by taking the room to a particular node on the route that migrants take from Central America. And this node of the viaje is a detention center in South Texas, in the small town of Dilley, Texas, located about an hour and a little bit south of San Antonio. And this detention center isn't just any detention center. It's actually the largest immigration detention center or jail in the United States, in this country of immigration gulags. This is the single largest facility with the largest number of beds. And the facility's official name is the South Texas Family Residential Center, which is an arresting euphemism for what it is. This is, in fact, a jail that detains migrant families. And when I say families, and I'm going to actually talk about that category a little bit later, what the family in Family Residential Center refers to is mothers with their minor children. Critics call this detention center baby jail. And I've visited baby jail 4 times since 2016. Most recently, 10 days ago. I was there with a group of my students. I took 9 undergraduate students from Barnard and Columbia who are in the audience with us here today. Thank you for coming. And we went as part of a class that I'm teaching called Seeking Asylum, History, Politics, and the Search for Justice on the US-Mexico border. While we were there, we were working under the auspices of a pro bono legal project. My students were translating, serving as translators, serving as legal assistants, providing basic know your rights information to migrants detained at this center, explaining to the women there how asylum law, this Kafkaesque system of asylum works, and helping them to understand what parts of their extraordinarily complex life stories and their stories of migration matter for the purposes of asylum law. So the students were helping women to understand which part of their complex narrative is going to be legible to government authorities in the United States. So I want to bring some reflections with you, to you here today from baby jail, and some reflections based on my experience or perceptions as a historian of childhood, which I'll talk about momentarily. And I do hope that we have time for Q&A. I know that we've run over on this session, but I hope we have time for Q&A. And I particularly like to encourage my students to participate in the Q&A because I think they have a unique perspective and have witnessed a lot of really critical things during our trip there. So baby jail was born in 2015 in the wake of the so-called surge of Central American families of 2014. Since that time, the composition of the jail has reflected the vicissitudes of hemispheric and global migration. Overwhelmingly, the population of baby jail, since its founding up until now, is dominated by migrants from the Northern Triangle, but there are also small numbers of Mexicans, Nicaraguans, Venezuelans at certain moments, Cubans, Haitians, Brazilians, Congolese, Romanians, Afghanis. So you can sort of trace waves of migration and over time, at least over the last 5 years, by looking at the composition of this center. So I want to help you to visualize what a baby jail looks like, because it's not obvious. The facility, rather than being a cement building with bars on the windows, which is maybe the vision that we might have of a jail, is actually comprised of a collection of trailers. And these trailers are plunked down helter-skelter in the middle of a large, dusty field on a country road, right down the way from a state prison. This baby jail, this detention center, was constructed in less than 3 months by CoreCivic, which is a private for-profit prison company, the largest in the country, which received a $1 billion no-bid contract from the US government to construct a detention center, especially for families. So as you might imagine, this detention center in Dilley is a truly surreal place. Imagine 2 parts Fort Leavenworth Penitentiary mixed in with 1 part Plaza Sésamo. Women and children, inmates, are given uniforms, but these are not, again, the uniforms that you might picture in your head when you think of a jail uniform. The uniforms are actually consist of bright, solid-colored shirts and sweatshirts, fuchsia, yellow, turquoise, blue jeans, colorful t-shirts with sometimes the moms and kids have matching laces. The facility has a playground that in the long months of summer bakes in the Texas sun. It has a trailer that is a school, which is, at least in theory, open several hours a day for the children detained there. And the residential areas, the pods that the women live in, are divided up into areas with names like Mariposa Azul and Loro Rojo. But the anodyne branding aside, this is a jail. The facility is surrounded by high fences, by floodlights, by guard stations. And from the road, it's actually kind of indistinguishable from the state prison just down the way. Inside, women wear ID badges in order to move around between trailers. And at night, guards make their rounds and shine their flashlights into the faces of sleeping residents, and they chase children who have moved from their own bunk bed to sleep with their mothers. They chase the children out of their bed back in, because of course, if you're taking inventory, you need to know that everybody is in their proper bed. So baby jail is emblematic, I think, of a critical characteristic of the so-called border crisis today. And I'm going to refer to the border crisis, but I do so hesitatingly and only because I don't have a better language to talk about it. I am well aware of the politics of calling it a border crisis. I'm well aware of how that word has been used politically, but I tried border event, border activity, acontecimiento. So I'm going to call it a crisis because I think it is a crisis, not necessarily in the way, however, that the Trump administration wants us to believe it's a crisis. So I want to talk about how baby jail is emblematic of a critical characteristic of the border crisis today, and that is the fact that it involves large numbers of children. According to the statistics of Customs and Border Protection, just this past month, CBP took into its custody some 40,000 children. So let's think about that number for a second. Mark made reference to Kindertransport, the kind of one of the most famous historical instances of child migration in the 20th century, in which Jewish children were spirited out of Germany and sent primarily to Britain. That historical migration involved something like 10,000 children over the course of, I think, a year or more. We're talking about 40,000 children over the course of a month here, okay? So, of course, this distinctive demographic composition of Central American migration today is widely discussed and recognized. We are often reminded by CBP and by the media here in the United States that when we're talking about Central American migrants, the kind of distinctive feature of this migration flow is that it involves unaccompanied minors on the one hand and families on the other. But I want to clarify what is meant by family and how the US government defines family. It counts something called unaccompanied minors, that is children who come not accompanied by a parent, but they also count something called family units. But the US government's definition of a family unit is different perhaps than what you might consider to be a family. A family unit does not refer to a husband and wife together or a pareja, right? It does not refer to, say, two adult siblings. It does not refer to an aunt, an uncle, and some nieces and nephews. A family unit refers specifically to one or more children traveling with one or more parents. So family is about a child-parent a group or a couple. That is to say, family is distinguished by the presence of a minor child in that family unit. Without a minor child, it's not a family, okay? So drawing back, we could say that this migration is characterized then by two kinds of child migrants, unaccompanied child migrants and accompanied migrants, right? And today, families and unaccompanied minors, this group of children as well as adults traveling with children, now significantly exceeds adults traveling on their own. Just to cite one recent statistic, again from the CBP, 43,000 people were apprehended traveling as a family unit or as an unaccompanied minor, 43,000 versus 23,000 as single adults. So we're talking about a very particular demographic characteristic in which children are predominant, And so when we talk about Central American border migration today, we're also talking about a child migration event, not just a Central American migration, but a child migration. And I think that that fact is central to understanding both the policy responses on the part of the US government, as well as the broader politics of migration and how migration in this migratory crisis / event is being talked about in the United States today. So this administration has, of course, been invoking a border crisis since before it ever even came to office, not particularly credibly, because as of course we know, apprehensions remain despite recent uptick, remain at historically low levels. More credibly, perhaps, is the administration's invocation of crisis to refer to the child part of this story. In recent weeks, we've heard border officials point to the humanitarian crisis engendered by the arrival of large numbers of families, i.e. children, at the border. We don't know what to do with them. What makes this phenomenon a crisis then, I think, is that it challenges ideas about who migrants are or who migrants should be. Historically, of course, on the US-Mexico border, the paradigmatic migrant has been the adult, young, male laborer, right? And the system of border apprehension and the system of border detention has been set up with that figure in mind. So in talking about a humanitarian crisis caused by child migration, there's an implicit assumption that there is something unusual or exceptional or problematic about child migration. And I want to make that assumption explicit. So let me pause briefly to say here that, and I think we've all introduced ourselves with varying kinds of caveats. I'm a journalist. I'm a historian of X, but not of Y. So here's my caveat. I'm a Latin American historian, but I am not a historian of Central America, nor am I a historian of migration. I am, however, a historian of childhood, and my reflections come from thinking about this problem through that perspective. So probably those of you who are not historians in the audience are perhaps going, history of childhood, like what the hell, that's a thing. It is a thing. I won't go into what it is exactly, but let me give you a brief idea. It has become commonplace in social scientific and academic circles in general to say that gender and race are social constructs. That is to say, a category like gender or race has no existence outside of the social meanings that we ascribe to it. Historians of childhood would say the same thing about childhood. Childhood is a category, an empty signifier into which we pour social meanings. And we have a whole series of assumptions about what a child is, about what children should do, about how they should be protected, about how they are innocent and vulnerable, about how they should have certain inalienable rights to certain kinds of protections and resources. And those assumptions shape how we think about children in general, and I would argue how we're thinking about this migration event. So I want to think about contemporary Central American migration as an instance of child migration specifically, to think about how thinking about child migration helps us to explain better what is going on. I want to think about the work, we might call it, the political work that childhood does in discussions about migration. And I want to think about the ways that child migration makes possible certain policy responses and political framings, but also forecloses other possibilities. This is a story about what childhood allows to make, it makes possible, but also what it forecloses. But let me step back for just a moment from that kind of abstract discussion and ask very briefly, why are children coming in seemingly unprecedented numbers today at the border? Is this unusual and exceptional? Has the paradigmatic migrant in fact shifted? And is that for good? I don't know if I can answer that question, but let me give you a couple of ideas. Those of you who work in Central America and on Central American migrants are, of course, very familiar with this story. But in the Dili detention facility last week, we heard countless stories about the unique dangers, first of all, that children face in the Northern Triangle. Young girls recruited as gang girlfriends, young boys recruited into the gangs. Oscar made a reference to the youth of recruits. So children face, I think, unique dangers, and that in part explains why they're migrating in large numbers. It is also the case that gangs, when gangs threaten and extort families, they very often target and threaten children, right? Children, again, childhood has a particular set of meanings and a particular set of associations. What better way to extort a father or a mother or an aunt or an uncle than to threaten to fill their child with lead, which is one of the things that I heard from a mother during one of my times in Dili. So children are a particular kind of booty, you might say, in this game, this performance of extortion. Children are also coming because they're being removed from situations of domestic violence. We talked to many women in Dili who were fleeing violent parejas. I think that's an under-discussed part of this migration phenomenon, gender-based violence and domestic violence. Many children were themselves victims of domestic violence or witnesses to it and were fleeing with their mothers as part of a situation of domestic violence. So in short, and this is not surprising to anyone here, the changing composition of migration flows and the presence specifically of children in those migration flows speaks to the changing drivers of migration, right? We all know that. We could add that another reason for the presence of children among these migration flows is frankly that US law incentivizes migrants to travel with children. And I'm going to talk about that momentarily and the ways that an adult traveling with a child will be treated differently than an adult traveling without a child. So the presence of children, in other words, speaks to, I think, how hardening border enforcement has spurred creative adaptations, frankly, and produced new strategies of mobility on the part of both traffickers and migrants. And among those strategies is the accompanying one with a child, right, in order to gain entry and begin the asylum process. At the same time, it seems to me that neither the prevailing conditions in Central American countries nor the peculiarities of US law and policy can fully explain what's going on. And that's because child migration is not just happening at the US-Mexico border and doesn't just involve Central American children. It is, in fact, a global phenomenon. And here's where we might take Jose Moya's cue to deprovincialize our vision, to pull back out from the hemisphere, and to recognize that what is being labeled at the US border as special or exceptional or unprecedented, namely the arrival of all these children, is, in fact, increasingly common the world over. According to the United Nations HCR, the High Commission on Refugees, over half of the 22.5 million refugees worldwide, over half are under age 18. According to UNICEF, the global number of refugee migrant children moving alone has reached a record high in the world. So we're talking about, children from Syria and Afghanistan, children from various parts of Africa. Children were a prominent presence in the so-called jungle of Calais, the refugee camp that Jose referenced earlier. So it suggests perhaps that maybe the problem is not that children are exceptional migrants, but that we need to shift our thinking about who a migrant is and our notion of the paradigmatic migrant. But I want to shift now my comments from thinking about the causes of child migration to thinking about the effects of child migration. Claudio mentioned that in his opening remarks, he put it very, very well. He invoked the political productivity of migration. And I think child migration is extraordinarily politically productive. Child migration has produced new institutions, it's produced new policies, and it's produced new discourses. As an example of a new institution produced by child migration, we have baby jail itself, right? The special detention centers, these bizarro Kafkaesque places of penitentiary slash Plaza Sésamo that are specifically designed for children. An example of a new policy produced by child migration is the zero tolerance policy of family separation last summer, which I will talk about momentarily, briefly. And it's produced new discourses about migration. So for example, we have the Trump administration framing migration today and child migration as an instance of child trafficking. That's a very particular way of thinking about and framing migration, right, as trafficking, that is produced by the fact that there are so many children. And it's obviously a framing that I don't agree with, and I'll talk about that momentarily. But if child migration has been productive of institutions and discourses and policies, I'd also argue that ultimately it has constrained in really fundamental ways the hand of this administration. It has not necessarily discouraged the boundless cruelty and lawlessness and incompetence of the Trump administration, but it has frankly constrained its power to act against migrants in the ways that it wishes to. So we have in recent weeks the Customs and Border Patrol dwelling on this idea of a humanitarian crisis at the border, that we just don't know what to do with these children, we don't have proper resources to deal with them in medical care, et cetera. I want to argue that the real crisis is perhaps not a humanitarian one, but rather the fact that these children represent a legal and political conundrum for this administration. The crisis, at least from the point of view of the administration, is a legal and political one. Let me explain what I mean by that. In fact, there are very powerful legal restraints that tie the hand of the administration when they deal with children and when they deal with adults who are traveling with children. One of those constraints, one of the key constraints, involves the detention of children. Now, as we know, detention is a central pillar of this administration's immigration policy. The day after the Trump, the elections, the stock prices of private prison corporations soared in anticipation of how well they were going to do under this administration. This is a system that thrives. We have an immigration gulag in this country, and it's a system that thrives on for-profit detention. There are today more adults in immigration detention than ever before. However, that policy doesn't work so well when it comes to children. And the reason is the following. In the 1990s, there was a little-known legal settlement known as the Flores decision, which stated that children cannot be detained for more than 20 days. Now, the Trump administration has violated, as did the Obama administration for that matter, has violated that agreement right and left, yet nevertheless, that is the law in the books, and that constrains what the administration can do. Children cannot be detained for more than 20 days, which means that at least if you're going to keep the parent and child together, you can't detain their parent either. That's how we get to family separation, right? So the fact that children cannot be detained presents a huge problem, and one that the Trump administration has attempted repeatedly to challenge. So far, I would argue unsuccessfully. Or I wouldn't argue, I think that's true. It hasn't been successful in challenging this legal settlement. You cannot put families in jail indefinitely in the way that you can put single adults in jail indefinitely. And again, from the point of view of the Trump administration, that's a problem. Now, as important as the legal constraints that child migrants pose, I would argue are the political or symbolic or discursive constraints that child migration poses. In a word, children represent a sympathetic population in a way that adult migrants cannot and probably will not. Public opinion has been a powerful brake on what this administration can do, and that has to do with the symbolic and cultural politics of childhood. Family separation is a case in point. Last summer, of course, the administration announced this catastrophic policy that it was going to start separating systematically. It was already doing this, but systematically separating parents and children coming over the border. There was as we all witnessed, not just a national, but indeed an international spark of outrage. Members of the public were outraged at the prospect of the government willfully and deliberately harming children as part of its immigration policy. And lo and behold, the administration was forced to lie and say there is no policy of separating children, which Bridget Nielsen, the head of DHS, actually got up and said that. And then when that didn't fly, they were forced to rescind the policy, right? Likewise, the recent deaths of two Guatemalan children in CBP custody in recent months sparked public outrage. And it caused an influx of resources and new procedures and medical screenings and all of this kind of stuff. Does anybody know how many adult migrants have died in US custody in recent months? Because I have no idea. And maybe you have no idea either. And that's not surprising. But we do know that two Guatemalan children, some of you probably remember the names of those children, the circumstances of their death. That's because we care about children dying in custody in a way that we don't care about adults. And I think that speaks to the symbolic politics of this and the constraints imposed by the fact that these migrants are children. Likewise, the detention of families has become a cause célèbre. We've heard about children in cages. We witnessed those extraordinary photographs of the tear gassing of migrants at the border and the mom with her toddler in diapers. The image on the cover of Time magazine of the little girl in the pink shirt looking up at Donald Trump looming over her. So the figure of the child is mobilized time and again by the opponents of this administration to challenge their migrant policies. So children have a symbolic power that I think presents a potent constraint on the lawlessness of this administration and on the cruelty of this administration. And conversely, immigrant rights activists and advocates have likewise successfully mobilized these images and this rhetoric of childhood and ideas about children's rights and the well-being of children and children have a right to their families. And we saw some of those, I think that some of that rhetoric in the video that we saw earlier. So we have rights activists have powerfully mobilized these ideas of the best interests of the child, of childhood innocence and vulnerability. The idea of baby jail itself, that very word captures, right, the mobilization of ideas about childhood and how babies aren't supposed to be in jail, right? At the same time, the administration has also played this discursive game and has also tried to mobilize ideas of childhood innocence and vulnerability. So how do you square a policy that criminalizes migrants with the fact that so many migrants are in diapers? Well, one way that you can do so is by painting migrant children not as criminals, but as victims of criminals. And here's where we get the child trafficking framing of migration. According to immigration officials, when parents hire smugglers or others to help spirit their children out of their homes and across the border, they become complicit in human trafficking. According to one ICE statement, the risks associated with smuggling children into the US present a constant humanitarian threat. The sponsors who have placed children directly into harm's way will be held accountable for their role in these conspiracies. Of course, the adults who should be held accountable for their role in these conspiracies are parents and family members who are looking out for presumably the best interests of these children. So migration involving children in this discourse is framed as something other than migration. It's framed as a criminal act, as human trafficking, right? And once again, the symbolic politics of childhood help us to understand where we get that rhetoric. So ultimately, I think thinking about, and here I want to wrap up, thinking about this migratory episode, event, crisis, whatever we want to call it, as an episode of child migration helps to illuminate certain dynamics. Child migration, again, has produced certain institutions and policies and ideas. Those responses reveal the unbounded cruelty, I think, of this administration, but they also reveal the limitations of its power. Many of the major efforts of anti-immigrant policy in the past 2 years, from family separation to attempts to abolish the Flores settlement, reflect attempts specifically to chip away at the legal and political constraints imposed by child migration. So far, those attempts have by and large failed. However, I don't want to end on an up note. Unlike Jose, I want to end on a down note because I think we've been through enough in the past few years to know that we should always keep our guard up. When we were at Dili in the last 10 days, there was discussion of, again, an unprecedented surge in migration of families at the border, new talk of a crisis, a kind of quickening drumbeat of worry and alarm. And so I think it remains to be seen where we're going. I'm frankly worried that this quickening drumbeat is going to be used as a pretext for the next god-awful policy of this administration. So I want to end on that down note. Thank you.
Thank you to the Center for Mexican Studies and its partners, and also the organizers of this conference. I'm really happy to be here. I am a graduate student in the Department of Anthropology here at Columbia, and today I will talk about two moments of Nicaraguan migration sparked by political unrest. First, I want to trace patterns of migration during the Sandinista Popular Revolution and the Contra War, so the period from 1979 to 1989, and then I will say a few things about the Nicaraguan migration crisis that is taking place today under the new Sandinista government. As most of you probably have heard, over 80,000 Nicaraguans have left the country in the past year, fleeing the brutal repression of the Nicaraguan state and irregular forces organized by the government against popular protests that began in April of 2018. As I hope to show, one of the primary drivers of outward migration during the 1980s were ongoing processes of internal displacement organized by the Sandinista state. So not only the Contra War itself, but the threat of being forcibly relocated drew people to leave the country. And this means that migration emerged primarily from particular areas, from particular zones, and happened in family units. And today, the political crisis in this other political moment, right, has produced migrants that have traveled alone and claim to be fleeing direct political persecution. So I will explore some of the differences in these two contexts because I think patterns of migration also point to paramount differences in the way in which these two Sandinista governments have sought to exercise control over the Nicaraguan population at moments when their hegemony has been threatened. As we have heard today, in the decade of the 1970s and 80s, revolutionary and counterinsurgent wars produced internal displacement and outward migration in all of Central America. An estimate of 250,000 Nicaraguans were internally displaced, and 150,000 left the country between 1979 and 1989. After the triumph of the Nicaraguan Revolution that overthrew the Somoza dictatorship that ruled Nicaragua with the backing of the United States government for 45 years. Of these, around 50 to 70,000 had official refugee status either in Honduras or in Costa Rica. Those that left Nicaragua early on were mostly politically motivated migrants from the upper middle class. That's like 30,000 perhaps. Some had direct ties to Somocismo, others migrated after being expropriated or due to fear for the establishment of a socialist regime in Nicaragua. Once the US-backed Contra War began in 1982, the composition of migration shifted as contra-insurgents organized in Honduras, on the border between Honduras and Nicaragua. In March of 1982, the Frente Democrático Nicaragüense, FDN, claimed attacks against state infrastructure in border towns and brutally violented presumed Sandinista collaborators, leading the Sandinista government to declare a nationwide state of emergency. This emergency declaration allowed the state to reconcentrate rural populations in conflict zones, forcibly displacing them and driving many of them to flee the country. Some 26,000, like some of the most dramatic movements, internal displacements happened. One happened in Corinto in the northwestern port town where 26,000 Nicaraguans were resettled in 1983. And even before this nationwide state of emergency was officially declared, the Sandinista government had declared a regional emergency in the northeastern part of the country in November of 1981 and had forcibly resettled some 8,500 Miskitu Indians, killing dozens in the process, an operation known as La Navidad Roja. Sandinista policy of internal displacements, justified as a humanitarian response to the Contra War, was also a way of controlling populations that previously lived outside of the purview of the state. Communities were resettled almost in their entirety, and families now concentrated in small areas were provided with social services like schooling and medical care, and they were also integrated into the agrarian reform by integrating them into cooperatives, or what the revolution called polos de desarrollo. But though they were set up in response to a declaration of emergency, these resettlements were planned to become permanent, productive communities. In the southern Caribbean, near the Costa Rican border, where I conducted field work listening to oral histories and memories of the Contra War back in 2011, forced displacements were remembered as a threat, a desgracia, paramount to that posed by the conflict, the Contra War itself. Between the end of 1982 and 1983, 70% of the population that lived near the Costa Rican border was relocated in 13 settlements and 26 cooperatives within a militarized area in the northeastern part of San Carlos, the major town in the southern Pacific of Nicaragua. Most people I encountered during this field work in the town of San Juan del Norte, which is it's the southeastern part of Nicaragua, also known as Greytown, avoided being displaced by migrating to Costa Rica. Starting in 1982, the town of San Juan del Norte, in the town there were rumors that ARDE, the Contra group that had organized around the Costa Rican border, was nearing the area, and the Sandinista state would forcibly displace them. Most of them fled the town to Costa Rica before the Sandinista state actually came, and they did come. So most people that left were received in Costa Rican refugee camps in Limon, and those that remained in San Juan were forcibly displaced by the Sandinista army to San Carlos between 1982 and 1983. Doña Veronica was one of them. She recalls 2 helicopters came to finally get around the 50 or so people that remained in the town. And I'm quoting her, "They told us to get 4 sets of clothing and that they would give us everything else we needed over there, but they did not give us anything." She says she had not left before, even though the Contra War was approaching, because most people had left to Costa Rica, and simply she did not want to migrate. There were no other alternatives except to go to Costa Rica, but she did not want to go. But after she was forcibly displaced and lived in the Polo de Desarrollo in San Carlos for a few years, she migrated to Costa Rica with her daughters. And she says about this experience: "When I was in San Carlos, in Nicaragua, in the 5 years that I lived there, I never got used to living there. When I went to Costa Rica, to the refugee camp, because they put us in a refugee camp with all of the other Sanjuaneños, I felt like I was in Greytown. All of my friends were there, and we could see each other. I felt tranquila." So in this decade, in addition to the terror infused by the Contra tactics themselves, we see the Sandinista state attempting to control populations and territory by displacing entire communities and also driving outward migration in this process. So after 1990, politically motivated migration presumably ended, and an important part of migrants returned through official repatriation programs. But migration, as we know, didn't stop. It actually increased. The peculiarities of the transition from quote-unquote war to quote-unquote peace, but also from a planned state-led economy to a market-led economy, produce new dynamics of migration. And I don't want to stop here too much, just to say one thing, that though it is true that in contrast to the rest of Central America, Nicaraguan migration after 1990 was not driven by insecurity resulting from the consolidation of transnational organized crime networks, as it is in the Northern Triangle. And we can indeed discuss why this is the case. This narrative of Nicaragua as an exceptional safe place is problematic. It tends to render invisible a number of issues concerning how violence is accounted for. But 2 notes on this moment. First of all, as I said, migration didn't stop. There's between 400,000 and 800,000 Nicaraguans living in Costa Rica. So although the US wasn't the primary place where economically led migrants went, Costa Rica was the alternative, and salaries in Costa Rica are 5 times salaries in Nicaragua. There's many incentives for going next door and not necessarily to the United States, although there's also migration into the United States. And the other thing I want to say is that evidently the post-war transition process had many failures. It did not effectively reincorporate thousands of combatants. It focused on disarmament and not in the process of reincorporation, and it did even less to redress the wrongdoing done to civilian populations. And there was no accountability process, no justice, no truth commissions. And on top of this, there was the neoliberal reform. So that was kind of the context of the 90s. But I want to leap in time to the current moment. So in April of 2018, student-led demonstrations erupted against an unpopular reform to the social security system that would decrease pensions while increasing workers and employment contribution. Increasing the contributions that workers and employers made into the system. Ortega had been back in power for 12 years now, since 2006, and had consolidated an authoritarian leadership style. He had named his wife vice president in 2016, and together they controlled executive, legislative, and judicial powers, as well as the police force and the army. Furthermore, the regime held a tight alliance with the Nicaraguan economic elites. Many of those same people that had migrated during the revolution and returned in 1990 were now allies to this so-called second phase of the Nicaraguan revolution. These became the only civil society group with a seat at the table of negotiations with Ortega and Murillo. They invested and made money, but they stayed out of politics. So in return, the regime promised, quote, social peace, that is, keeping minimum wage low and ensuring there would be no, quote, social disturbances. Throughout the last 12 years, the regime exercised targeted repression against social movement leaders, peasants, feminists, environmentalist groups, and they also maintained strong social control over the general population in different ways. However, the regime governed with minimal recourse to force, relying on tactics of cooptation, negotiation, and suppression of dissent. This past April, there was a rupture. On April 19th, the regime attempted to mobilize public university students to march in favor of the reforms. This type of partisan mobilization was a common practice of the Sandinista government. However, students revolted, they resisted going to this march and began protests demanding a halt to the Social Security reform, as well as university autonomy. The Ortega regime responded to these student-led demonstrations with excessive force, killing 3 people in the first full day of protests on April 19th. And then the next day, the protests erupted nationwide. And 4 days later, the death toll had risen to 54. A pattern emerged in the killings, in the victims. The majority had bullet wounds to the heart and to the neck. Police forces and unidentified snipers were shooting with precision to kill. Ortega refused to acknowledge the deaths. Instead, he announced he would recall the Social Security reform, and he called the Nicaraguan business sector back into the dialogue. Nicaraguans, angered at this official response, began calling for his resignation, organizing the largest mobilizations in Nicaraguan history. The number of deaths doubled by late May. Peasants and members of popular barrios in the cities began building roadblocks to protect themselves from police forces, as well as to disrupt commercial activity. Every night at dawn, police and unidentified armed persons that acted alongside them would attack these roadblocks, leaving protesters injured and killed. In the span of a few weeks, my generation, the first so-called post-war, post-revolutionary generation born into peace, learned to distinguish between types of gunshots. words like AK-47 and Dragunovs became part of our vocabulary. Once Ortega realized that the uprising wouldn't cease, the attacks on the roadblocks were no longer hidden from view. Can you stay on that picture? Okay. In late June and early July, pickup trucks carrying hundreds of men in hoods wearing the same color t-shirts and carrying military caliber weapons and Sandinista flags openly paraded through the streets along with police forces. Together, they killed, detained in clandestine prisons, and tortured people with impunity. Their joint actions were even publicized and celebrated in official government outlets. It's images from the Sandinista newspaper where you can see that image of those paramilitary groups along with police. Yeah, so scroll down, please. This is the, more. So they're celebrating this so-called liberation of Masaya. That, can you go to the end? Yeah. There's that image of the paramilitary groups, and then the next one is the police organized in the same place with the same flag, the same thing. El 19 Digital is a Sandinista, like official government-sponsored newspaper. So they're not even hiding the fact that they have organized paramilitary forces that are acting with police, and then later Ortega said they were voluntary police officers, these paramilitary groups. So I'm gonna skip through some of this. The death toll rose to 325. The degree and span of the repression forced thousands of Nicaraguans to flee to safeguard their lives. The Servicio Jesuita a Migrantes has detailed that around 80,000 have left the country, with 52,000 arriving in Costa Rica. Because the Nicaraguan political crisis is such a recent development, and the nature of the dictatorship is to construct this universe of lies around what happened. There are things we still don't know about the situation, but there are some preliminary thoughts that I have. So because the Nicaraguan political crisis is, first and foremost, quantity leaving in such a short span of time, the 3-month period between June and August, is, I think, without precedent in recent history in our region. Second, this migration is largely driven by direct persecution by the state or government organized paramilitaries. So there's right now 800 political prisoners that were detained by these joint paramilitary and police forces. They're being criminalized with 200-year sentences for so-called terrorism. There's no recourse to the law in any sense in the way that they're detained in the processes, and the repression has used the Sandinista neighborhood organizations to gather information about people, and so they're targeting in every neighborhood, in every part of the country, they're targeting people that may have just given water to the people that were organized in the barricades. It's very, very specific and very detailed, the amount of information that they're gathering about people. So something that data gathered from the NGO Techo in Costa Rica that conducted a census of people that had just recently arrived, they show that more than half say that they migrated because of fear of their own family integrity or direct political persecution against them. And even though the economic crisis that has developed alongside this is abysmal, there's 400,000 jobs were lost. They clearly they detail that they are migrating because of the terror that has been infused. So while in the 80s, many migrants felt themselves caught between sides in a war, and they migrated as family units, today the nature of the repression, that is the presence of paramilitary forces, the use of local intelligence to terrorize, the de facto suspension of the rule of law, has driven people persecuted individuals to leave and to leave their families behind. A third reflection is that this category of political persecutions by the state, as Claudio mentioned, in a different context, has brought international attention that other kinds of migratory flows haven't had. There is more consensus in the international community around holding Ortega accountable for crimes against humanity than there is, let's say, in the Venezuelan case, right? So and the proofs of these crimes are overwhelming. They're even in the government rhetoric and their publicity. I think I'm going to end there. Thank you.
I wanted to share a line of inquiry for future research rather than present research that I've already completed. As we know, I'm finishing a book about the adoption of Guatemalan children on the international adoption market. Demographers have sometimes called international adoption the quiet migration. During the course of the research in Guatemala, I became aware of another form of quiet migration that's not unknown. Irene, you mentioned it in your presentation, the sort of substream of indigenous migration within the broader Guatemalan migration. While this is known to scholars in the US and is known in Guatemala, it's not part of the public discourse in the United States about migrants and migration from Central America. So I want to pull on that thread today and end with an observation about including deportation as a form of migration in our analysis of Central American migration more broadly. Because everyone is positioning themselves, I'm a journalist, I'm a historian, what I do want to say is that I don't speak a Mayan language, and in the course of my presentation, the importance of that will become clear. Most historians for a presentation would start in the past and then move forward and sort of brush against the present. Toward the end of the talk, I'm going to do the opposite, which is begin in the present and sort of brush against the past on my way out the door. I want to start with a name that you probably will all know, Jacqueline Calmaquin. Nara Milanic mentioned her this morning. She was 7 years old when she died in Customs and Border Patrol custody last December after crossing the border with her father. Just a week ago, doctors reviewed the newly public autopsy report of her death. They said she had a bacterial infection that was so advanced that her condition would be clear to anyone who looked at her. She was visibly ill for hours before her death. Jacqueline was indigenous. Her family is from Rashruja, Alta Verapaz in Guatemala. They speak Quechua. And Jacqueline and her father crossed the border with a group of 163 migrants, and then they were apprehended by the Border Patrol. They spent the next 8 hours in a very remote area of New Mexico, and Jacqueline was not placed on the first bus that was headed to the nearest Border Patrol station where she would have been able to avail herself of medical care. Why was that? Why was she not placed on that bus as a matter of great urgency if she was visibly ill? Jacqueline's father allegedly signed a form given to him by a member of the Border Patrol. The form said that Jacqueline was healthy when she was apprehended. Lawyers representing the family have said that that form was in English, which the father obviously did not speak. I want to pause on that. Even if the form had been in Spanish, it would not have been enough in order for a real form of communication to take place. According to The Guardian, Jacqueline's father, quote, communicated with border agents in Spanish, but primarily he speaks the Mayan language, Quechua. So what kind of exchange might have been possible here at this remote outpost of the border control? I want to use my space today to think about this kind of desencuentro between the Border Patrol and Mayan families that they apprehend. The Border Patrol very proudly claims that all of their agents are bilingual, English and Spanish. All that means is that they're required to take an 8-week training course, and sometimes that's it. So the level of bilingual capacity is certainly questionable. There are 19,000 agents of the Border Patrol, more than half of whom are Latino, which is something that is not always commented on. The Border Patrol not only lack Mayan language skills, but they also often don't know how to identify which Mayan language they're hearing when they're hearing it. As people in the room may know, there are 21 Mayan languages. There is additionally Xinca and Garifuna spoken by Guatemalans. Some indigenous Guatemalans are fully fluent in Spanish. Others and this is a kind of complex social phenomenon that I'm going to simplify, others feel forced to pretend that they have a higher level of Spanish than they might because of extreme racial discrimination in Guatemala, because of pena, which is unfortunately an important social force in Guatemala. An estimated 7% of Guatemalans speak only a Mayan language, and I encourage us to be suspicious of these statistics as they tend to be round, and it's not always very clear what kind of studies they come from. But a small but not insignificant number of Mayan Guatemalans are not fluent in Spanish. They're not bilingual. Women comprise a larger percentage of that group than men. I'm focusing on the linguistic element of indigeneity today. However, I do want to say that Indigenous identity is very complicated in Guatemala. It's not a simple matter of bloodlines, obviously, because nearly everyone in the country has Mayan ancestry. It's not just a matter of clothing, although that's often used to visually identify people, particularly women, as Indigenous. And it's not a static identity either. One can move from being Indigenous to Ladino and back again. My purpose here today is not to taxonomize which Guatemalan migrants are fully Indigenous, or what that means, or what counts as Indigenous when, but I just want to put the difference between Indigenous and Ladino migrants on the table in our discussion of Central American migration. We know about the 2 children who died in US custody this year. They were both Indigenous Guatemalan children. We don't know how many adult Indigenous people have died in custody. Asylum seeking. Once Guatemalan migrants who are Indigenous do make it to the United States, providing that they do, they are doubly discriminated against in the asylum seeking process. Access to language is a civil right outlined in a 1974 Supreme Court case, which expanded the definition of discrimination in this country. This was based on the Civil Rights Act, which made it illegal for programs that receive federal funding to discriminate on the basis of national origin. So this Civil Rights Act has been applied in many ways, and the 1974 case that I'm referring to found that it applied to children who attended schools but spoke limited English. So their civil right was to have access to bilingual or some kind of on-ramp into the English language in which they would be educated. The Center for American Progress, among others, are now arguing that this finding applies to asylum seekers' rights to Indigenous language interpretation in the United States. That is an effort, not a reality, as we'll highlight. Too often, instead, the scenario of Indigenous language speakers trying to seek asylum in the United States reflects reality that Mexican author Valeria Luiselli describes in Tell Me How It Ends, which is probably the book that's been most widely read on this phenomenon in English in the United States. In her book, Luiselli describes translating for unaccompanied minors as they prepare their asylum cases, and she describes meeting 2 girls in this way. Quote, "They're 5 and 7 years old, and they're from a small village in Guatemala. Spanish is their second language, but the older girl speaks it well," unquote. And then she goes on to say slightly later in the book, quote, "It was going to be very hard with the answers I was getting to even find them a lawyer willing to take their case. The girls were so young, and even if they had a story that secured legal intervention in their favor, they didn't know the words necessary to tell it. For children of that age, telling a story in a second language, translated to a third, a round and convincing story that successfully inserts them into legal proceedings working up to their defense is practically impossible," end quote. And then what happens is that those 2 girls fall out of the story entirely. They disappear from the book, and the narrative centers on a Spanish language fluent Honduran asylum seeker. So we know that there's a crisis of underrepresentation in the system, and that those who secure legal representation are much more likely to get asylum in the US, although as we saw in an earlier presentation, those numbers are still very low compared to Ethiopians or Eritreans, et cetera. One of the issues is that there are not good numbers on what percentage of asylum seekers from Guatemala are Indigenous. A researcher named Blake Gentry claims that as many as a third of migrants crossing through Arizona don't speak Spanish. This seems unbelievably high to me, and it's based on a very small sample size. However, we know that there is a very significant chunk of the Guatemalan migrants coming to the United States who either don't speak Spanish as their first language or don't manage Spanish with enough fluency to guarantee equitable access to the asylum process. For Indigenous migrants, getting an appropriate translator in the US is almost impossible. This has been not very frequently in the public eye, although there was a New York Times story over the weekend, over two weekends ago, that highlighted this issue, and I was very glad to see it because this is not often covered by journalists or in the public eye. However, the statistics that we do have are very surprising. Mam, Quiche, and other indigenous languages spoken in Guatemala have each become one of the 25 most common languages spoken in immigration court over the past few years. So in the top 10 languages for 2016, which are the most recent statistics that we have, the number one language for asylum cases was Spanish, followed by English, Mandarin, Punjabi, Arabic, Creole, Russian, Portuguese, and then number 9 was Mam, and number 10 was Quiche. These are total numbers, so imagine proportional to population. This is extraordinary, right? So Mam has now been in the top 10 languages used in asylum cases, together with Spanish, Arabic, and these other major world languages. Who's doing this interpretation, if anyone? Nearly all in-person interpreters used in courts come from one Virginia-based company. It is called SOS International. They have an $80 million contract with the federal government, and they are extremely cagey about what languages they speak, how many interpreters they have, and what exactly is the nature of their process, when they're called, who they decide to translate for, and why. So first item of business would be finding out more about that process. According to an indigenous translator, migrants who speak only rudimentary Spanish will often try to get by in that language. So again, we think that these are undercounts. And then there's the issue, right, of relay translation. So you would think the best possible translation would be a translator who speaks Quiche, for example, and English, translating directly from Quiche into English. That best case scenario very rarely takes place. What is much more common is to find a Quiche speaker who is comfortable translating into Spanish, then the Spanish is translated into English. So what you're engaging in is a form of the game of telephone, right, where a lot of crucial details are lost. And this is assuming that linguistic issues are the only ones at play. They're not. There are a lot of cultural and legal factors that are very troublesome when you try to translate from one language to another. There's a young translator in Oakland, California, in the Fruitvale part of California. If you get off the BART, the public transportation, you are in Todos Santos, Cuchumatan. It's incredible. So there's a young translator who's based there who's trying to put together a legal dictionary, and he's one of the few translators who translates from Quiche directly into English. And what he has said is that it's not just a matter of linguistic translation, but a matter of translating legal concepts in a way that are going to be understandable and culturally appropriate for the Quiche community. So in Guatemala, for example, it's not that you just have the Ladino legal system. You have multiple legal systems layered on top of one another, the most famous example of which is Totonicapan. But they're all over Guatemala. There are these kind of multiple legal systems. So the translator is facing linguistic difficulties, cultural difficulties, and legal difficulties. I'm very anxious to see this legal dictionary and translation device if this young translator can manage to get it together. I want to also mention the war, the Guatemalan Civil War, as important context for this indigenous migration. So, a few weeks after Jacqueline died, another indigenous Guatemalan child died in custody. His name was Felipe Gomez Alonso, and he had the flu and a very serious infection. He was 8 years old when he died, and he was from Yalambojosh, which is a very small town in the Nenton province of Huehuetenango. His family is also indigenous, they speak Chuch. A reporter who visited the town for Plaza Publica, which is a Guatemalan news outlet, said that very few people there speak Spanish. Felipe told his father before he died that he didn't know what was wrong with him and that he felt like he had something stuck in his throat. He was transferred to a New Mexico hospital, but died in that hospital. And I think it's important to point out that this community, Felipe's community, is made up of people who had already been refugees. They were refugees during the Guatemalan Civil War in Mexico. And Yalambojosh is an aldea, like a town made up of the families who fled to Mexico during the Guatemalan Civil War and only returned after the signing of the peace accords. So the question that I want to pose to you all is, if the migrants from Guatemala are from the poor families that, as we learned from Jose Moya this morning, can nevertheless afford to migrate. So if the migrants from Guatemala are from these poorest families, and a big subset of this group is indigenous, as we learned from Irena, who are we really talking about here? And how does the slogan, the activist slogan, "We are here because you were there," meaning we are here in the United States because you, the United States military, was there, Central America, during the Central American Civil Wars. If we bring indigenous Guatemalans more strongly into the conversation, how does that activist slogan start to resonate in a slightly different way? So we know that during the Guatemalan Civil War, which lasted from 1960 to 1996, racism turned into genocidal acts. And the war is very complex. It had many different phases. But the phase that I'm talking about here starts with the Panzos massacre in 1978 and continued on through the kind of worst killings of the early 1980s, and then kind of was bracketed in some ways and not in other ways by the nominal return to democracy in 1985, right? So during the Civil War, 200,000 people were killed, 1 million were displaced. The majority of those displaced were internally displaced within Guatemala, but about an estimated 200,000 people crossed into Mexico, and of that group, 40,000 lived in refugee camps. And so I was doing some archival research in, I'm a historian, like I said. I was doing some archival research in San Cristobal de las Casas in Chiapas for completely different reasons. And I came across a lot of documentation relating to the indigenous refugee communities in Mexico during the 1980s. And one of the things that I found were a huge stack of letters written by refugees who were indigenous Guatemalans in 1984. And these letters were written to President Miguel de la Madrid, asking to stay in their community in Chiapas and not to be moved to Campeche, which was the plan. And they had heard that this was possible on the kind of community radio. 3 minutes. I will speed up. These letters are from 1984. As I said, they're clearly form letters. Sometimes the community would write one letter in common and then sign it all with fingerprints. And their justifications for opposing this move to Campeche were really interesting. They said it was too far, it was not indigenous enough, more children would die along the way, and eventually the Guatemalans wanted to return. They specifically said, "We do not want to become Mexican." And they also write about the person-to-person aid that they received in Chiapas from the people that they call their indigenous brothers in Mexico. And they don't want to move away from that source of support and solidarity in the 1980s. So I wanted to raise that and conclude by saying the Guatemalan Civil War context is really important because in the Mexican context, the indigeneity of the refugees was understood by all, whereas in the US context, in a completely different moment, that nevertheless has roots in the Guatemalan Civil War, the indigenous identity or identities of the Guatemalan migrants is often not taken into account. So the last thing I'll say is that another legacy of the Guatemalan Civil War that I think is very important to raise in the asylum context is fear. Linda Green says it in the title of her book, Fear as a Way of Life. This is about Guatemala during the Civil War. The Civil War shredded the social fabric in Guatemala. So you don't just tell a stranger the worst thing that has ever happened to you, particularly a policeman or official of any kind. So what I'm trying to suggest is that there are cultural and historical, not just linguistic barriers to overcome in order to give people a fair asylum hearing in the United States. And until we recognize that the subgroup of indigenous migrants from Guatemala have special needs and special concerns in this process, we're not going to give a fair and equitable process, which seems utopian compared to what is actually happening. But I just wanted to flag this one additional concern for a group that is doubly, triply, quadruply discriminated against. So thank you very much.